7 military dogs suddenly broke formation in the middle of a Memorial Day demonstration and ran straight toward an old woman sitting alone on a folding chair at the edge of the parade ground. Handlers shouted commands. Nobody listened. The crowd gasped as the German shepherds shoved past startled officers, knocked over a row of metal chairs, and surrounded the woman like she was the only person who mattered on that entire base. One of them, a massive shepherd named Tank, pressed his head straight into her lap and refused to move. The base commander stood frozen, his mouth half open, his clipboard slipping out of his hand, because in 22 years of service he had never once seen a working dog disobey a direct order. Not one. And now 7 of them, dogs that didn't even know each other, dogs trained at different kennels in different states, were all doing the exact same thing at the exact same time. They were crying, whining low in their throats the way a dog only does when it senses grief it cannot explain. And the woman, 81 years old, wearing a thin grey cardigan and clutching an old photograph to her chest, just sat there, silent, tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. Nobody at that ceremony knew her name. Nobody had spoken to her all morning. She had been invited as a courtesy, one more folding chair in the back row, one more elderly face in a sea of decorated veterans and proud families. But something about her had reached straight through years of rigorous military training and pulled 7 dogs off their leashes of obedience. A young handler named Corporal Davis dropped to his knees beside Tank, trying to pull him back by the collar. The dog wouldn't budge. He looked up at the corporal with eyes that seemed almost human, almost desperate, like he was trying to say something nobody in that crowd was equipped to understand. And then the woman whispered 4 words. Just 4. Quiet enough that only the dogs seemed to hear them clearly. But whatever those words were, they made every single shepherd lower their heads in unison, as if she had just given the only command that mattered. Her name was Eleanor Marsh, and 3 weeks before that Memorial Day ceremony, she had been nothing more than the quiet woman who lived alone at the end of Birchwood Lane, the one neighbors waved to, but rarely spoke with, the one who walked to the mailbox every afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, and never seemed to be waiting for anything in particular. She was 81 years old, widowed for 19 of those years, and her small 2-bedroom house still had a coat rack by the door with a single worn leather jacket hanging on it that nobody but her ever touched. Eleanor's days followed a routine so steady you could set a clock by it. She woke before sunrise out of habit, made 1 cup of coffee in a chipped mug that said "World's Best Dad," watered the geraniums on her porch, and spent most afternoons in a wicker chair with a paperback novel she rarely finished. She didn't have much family left. A daughter in Ohio who called on Sundays. A grandson who sent a card on her birthday and sometimes forgot. The kind of quiet, dignified loneliness that so many widows carry without ever complaining about it. Because complaining had never been her way, she had worked 31 years as a school librarian in the same small Virginia town. And the children who once sat cross-legged on her reading rug were now grown with children of their own. Most of them didn't remember her name anymore. That was the strange ache of growing old in a small town. You watch generations pass through your hands like sand, and somehow you end up forgotten by the very people you helped raise. She kept her house tidy, her lawn trimmed, and her grief folded so neatly into the corners of her life that most people never noticed it was there at all. But it was there. It had always been there, tucked into a cedar box on her closet shelf. Beneath folded sweaters and an old wool blanket sat a manila envelope she hadn't opened in almost 2 decades. She knew exactly what was inside it. A photograph, a set of dog tags, and a letter she had read only once, the night the two uniformed officers had come to her door and told her that her husband, Staff Sergeant Harold Marsh, was not coming home from Da Nang. Harold had been a dog handler. Most people in town didn't know that detail, because Harold had rarely spoken about the war once he came home the first two tours, and there had been no homecoming after the third. What people in town did remember vaguely, the way you remember something told to you once at a funeral and then never again, was that there had been a dog, a German shepherd, that served beside Harold for years before he was killed. The dog's name had been Duke, and according to the one story Eleanor had ever told anyone, Duke had refused to leave Harold's side even after the transport plane brought him home in a flag-draped case. Eleanor never spoke of Duke either. The army had explained that working dogs in that era weren't always brought home with their handlers' families, that there were policies, that the dog had been reassigned, retrained, passed from unit to unit till eventually his record simply stopped. No final report, no closure, just an ending that trailed off into silence, the same way so much about that war had trailed off into silence for an entire generation of families. So Eleanor had spent 19 years quietly grieving 2 losses instead of 1. A husband she buried with full honors, and a dog she never got the chance to say goodbye to, who she sometimes wondered about late at night when the house felt too big and too quiet. Had he lived? Had he ever found peace? Had anyone ever told him that the family he protected still thought about him? She never imagined that any of that would matter to anyone outside her own 4 walls. She had accepted, the way the elderly often learn to accept things, that some questions simply die unanswered and you carry them anyway because there's no other choice. That was Eleanor Marsh 3 weeks before 7 military dogs broke formation and ran straight to her. The invitation to the Memorial Day demonstration had come almost by accident. A volunteer from the local VFW chapter, going through decades-old service records to compile a list of surviving military spouses for the regional ceremony, had stumbled across Harold Marsh's name and, beside it, a small handwritten note from an old quartermaster's ledger that nobody had bothered to digitize. The note simply read, K9 handler, 3 tours, dog reassigned post-Kaya. The volunteer, a kind but overworked woman named Patricia, hadn't thought much of the detail. She mailed Eleanor a formal invitation along with 40 other widows and surviving family members, expecting, at best, a polite RSVP and a quiet afternoon in the crowd. When Eleanor arrived at the base that morning, she was exactly what so many people at these ceremonies have learned to overlook. An elderly woman in a modest cardigan, walking slowly with a cane, holding a small black handbag with both hands like it, contained something fragile. Nobody from the organizing committee greeted her personally. She was shown to a folding chair near the back of the demonstration field, given a small paper program, and largely left alone, while officers in dress uniforms mingled near the front with decorated veterans, congressmen, and a row of honored Gold Star families who had been seated up, close with name placards and photographers, waiting to capture their grief for the local news. Eleanor didn't mind the back row. She had spent 19 years learning not to expect the front of anything. She settled into her chair, smoothed her cardigan over her knees, and watched the ceremony unfold, the way she watched most things now, quietly, from a respectful distance, the photograph of Harold tucked inside her handbag, because she had decided, almost on impulse that morning, to bring it with her for the first time in years. The demonstration itself was a K9 unit showcase. 7 working German shepherds from 3 different military and police kennels performing obedience drills, search demonstrations, and a tribute formation meant to honor military working dogs throughout history. A young captain at the podium spoke about loyalty and sacrifice, about dogs who had saved thousands of lives across decades of American conflicts, about the bond between handler and animal that civilians could never fully understand. A few rows ahead of Eleanor, two younger women in sharp blazers exchanged a glance and a small laugh when an organizer mentioned that several elderly guests had been buzzed in from a regional senior center, gesturing vaguely toward the back rows without checking who was actually sitting there. One of them murmured something about how nice it was that the program included everybody, in a tone that suggested otherwise. Eleanor heard it. She always heard those comments, the soft, careless ones people make about the elderly without realizing the person in question can hear every word. She had learned long ago not to let her face show it. A retired colonel near the front made a joke into his microphone about how the dogs had better behave today, since there were cameras rolling, and the crowd chuckled politely. Nobody in that crowd, not the colonel, not the captain at the podium, not the photographers adjusting their lenses, had the faintest idea that one quiet widow in the back row was about to upend the entire ceremony. The handlers brought the 7 shepherds out onto the field in a tight, disciplined line, each dog sitting perfectly still beside its handler, eyes forward, muscles coiled with the kind of trained stillness that takes years to build. The crowd applauded. The captain began describing the obedience routine that was about to begin. And then, without warning, without a single command given, Tank's head snapped toward the back row. It started so small that almost nobody noticed at first. Tank, the lead shepherd, a 7-year-old dog with a broad chest and a graying muzzle, lifted his nose and went rigid. His handler, Corporal Davis, gave the command to hold position. Tank didn't move his paws, but his whole body had turned, as if his training and his instincts were suddenly at war with each other. The captain kept talking. The other dogs sat obediently, but one by one the remaining 6 shepherds began to mirror Tank's posture. Ears up, noses lifted, eyes locked on the same direction, toward a woman in a gray cardigan who hadn't moved from her folding chair. A murmur rippled through the front rows as people began to notice the dogs weren't responding to the routine anymore. The captain glanced over his shoulder, confused, and gave a hand signal to the handlers to reset the formation. 6 handlers tried. 6 dogs ignored them. Then Tank broke. He didn't lunge aggressively. He didn't bark. He simply stood, pulled gently but firmly against Corporal Davis's hold, and when the young corporal instinctively loosened his grip out of sheer surprise, Tank was gone, bounding across the open field with a kind of urgent, almost desperate grace, straight toward the back row. Within seconds, the other 6 dogs followed, breaking formation entirely, ignoring shouted commands from 4 different handlers, weaving between folding chairs and startled onlookers until all 7 shepherds had surrounded one elderly woman, sitting perfectly still, with her hands pressed to her mouth. Tank reached her first and pushed his big head directly into her lap, the way a dog does when it has found something it has been searching for without ever knowing it was searching. The others crowded around her chair, some sitting, some standing with their noses pressed gently against her arms and shoulders, all of them whining softly, a low chorus of sound that silenced the entire demonstration field. Tank heel, Tank down. Corporal Davis was sprinting across the grass, his voice cracking with disbelief. The dog didn't even flick an ear in his direction. A senior handler, a weathered woman named Master Sergeant Renee Coyle, who had spent 18 years training military working dogs, jogged up behind him, breathless, and stopped dead in her tracks at what she saw. 7 different training backgrounds, 7 different handlers, all of them disobeying direct commands simultaneously, all of them fixated on the same elderly stranger. "That's not possible," Coyle whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "Dogs don't do this. Not like this. Not all of them at once." The crowd had gone almost completely silent. 300 people watching a scene none of them could explain. Somewhere near the front, a photographer's camera shutter clicked rapidly, capturing what would later become the single most shared image to ever come out of that base's public affairs office. 7 military working dogs surrounding a weeping widow, none of them willing to leave her side. Eleanor sat frozen, her hands trembling as Tank's warm weight pressed against her knees. She had not said a word. She had not called out to the dogs. She had simply been sitting there, holding the photograph of Harold she'd finally worked up the courage to bring when the world around her had erupted into something she couldn't begin to understand. "Ma'am." Master Sergeant Coyle had reached the chair now, crouching slowly, cautiously, careful not to spook the dogs further. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. I don't know what's gotten into them. Are you all right? Did you do anything? Say anything before they came over here?" Eleanor shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't do anything. I was just sitting here." Coyle studied the 7 dogs more carefully now, the way a trained professional studies behavior she cannot immediately explain. They weren't acting aggressive. There was no threat posture, no bared teeth, nothing in their body language that resembled the assertive dominance she had seen 1,000 times in her career. This was something else entirely. This looked like grief. It looked like recognition. Her eyes drifted down to the small photograph, still clutched in Eleanor's trembling hands, the edges worn soft from age, the image faded but still visible. A young soldier in uniform, kneeling in the dirt beside a German shepherd puppy, both of them squinting into bright sunlight, both of them smiling like the whole world was still ahead of them. "Ma'am," Coyle said carefully, her voice dropping low, "who is that in the photograph?" Eleanor's lip trembled. "My husband," she said. "Harold and his dog, Duke." The name hit the air like a struck match. Tank's head lifted from Eleanor's lap. His ears swiveled forward sharply, and the low whine in his throat deepened into something that sounded impossibly, almost like a moan of recognition. Master Sergeant Coyle had been around working dogs long enough to know that something about this moment did not belong in the category of coincidence. She gently asked Eleanor if she would be willing to come with her to a quieter area, away from the crowd, where they could talk without 300 onlookers and a row of confused photographers documenting every second. Eleanor nodded, and with surprising gentleness. All 7 dogs rose and walked alongside her chair as 2 handlers helped her to her feet, forming an unintentional honor guard that left the entire crowd murmuring in hushed disbelief. They moved into a small administrative tent near the edge of the field, the canvas walls muffling the noise of the ceremony, resuming awkwardly behind them. Tank refused to sit anywhere except pressed against Eleanor's leg. The other 6 dogs arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around her folding chair. Lying down now, calmer, but their eyes never leaving her. "Mrs. Marsh," Coyle said, pulling up a chair across from her. "I need to ask you some questions, and I know this might feel strange, but please bear with me. You said your husband was a dog handler. Can you tell me more about that?" Eleanor took a slow breath, smoothing the photograph against her knee. Harold served 3 tours. He was a military police dog handler in Vietnam. His partner was Duke, a German shepherd. They trained together for almost 2 years before his final deployment. Harold used to write me letters about that dog, more than he wrote about almost anything else. He said Duke understood him than most people did. Her voice caught. Harold was killed in 1971. An ambush. I was told Duke survived, but that he couldn't come home with us. There were rules back then about working dogs. They were considered equipment, not family. He was reassigned somewhere, and I never heard anything else. Not one word in 55 years. Coyle's expression had shifted into something carefully controlled, the look of a professional trying not to let her own emotions surge ahead of the facts. Mrs. Marsh, do you know if Duke had any identifying marks? A tattoo number, a specific marking, anything from his service record? Eleanor shook her head helplessly. I was never told anything like that. I was a young wife with a folded flag and an envelope I couldn't bring myself to open for years. Nobody explained military working dog protocols to grieving widows back then. They just told us our husbands weren't coming home, and that was supposed to be enough information for an entire lifetime. Coyle reached for a tablet resting on the small table beside her and began typing rapidly. I want to check something. It's going to take a few minutes, but I think it might explain what just happened out there. While she worked, one of the younger handlers, a private named Sanchez, who had brought one of the 7 dogs that day, knelt slowly beside Eleanor's chair, studying Tank with new curiosity. Ma'am, can I ask, did your husband's dog have any particular commands he responded to? Anything unusual? Maybe a nickname? A phrase only the two of them used? Eleanor's eyes filled again. Harold used to call him Old Soldier, not Duke, just Old Soldier, like a joke between them. He wrote that the dog would perk up every single time he said it, like the words themselves meant something special. Sanchez looked up sharply at Coyle, who had stopped typing entirely, staring at her screen with an expression that made the entire tent go quiet. Master Sergeant, Sanchez said carefully, what did you find? Coyle turned the tablet around slowly so Eleanor could see the screen, though the older woman's eyes weren't sharp enough anymore to read the small print clearly. Mrs. Marsh, I'm going to read something to you, and I need you to understand I am not entirely certain yet what this means, but I think we may be looking at something none of us expected. She cleared her throat. There's a historical lineage record buried in the regional kennel archive, the kind of paperwork almost nobody digs up anymore because it predates digital record keeping. It traces working dog bloodlines used for breeding programs after Vietnam-era dogs were retired domestically instead of being euthanized overseas, which was unfortunately common practice at the time for dogs that couldn't be repatriated. One dog in that lineage record is listed simply as Duke, retired 1971, transferred to a domestic breeding and training program in 1972. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Tank, Coyle continued, her voice unsteady now, is 4 generations removed from that same bloodline. He's not the same dog, Mrs. Marsh. That's biologically impossible after 55 years. But he carries that dog's line, and dogs, especially working-line German Shepherds, can carry behavioral instincts and even some scent recognition patterns passed down through careful breeding programs in ways that surprise even people who've studied this their whole careers. The tent fell completely silent, except for the soft, rhythmic breathing of 7 dogs, who somehow, against every law of biology anyone in that tent could explain, had reacted to a scent, a sound, or some buried fragment of inherited memory. The moment an old woman whispered a name that hadn't been spoken aloud at that base in over half a century. Word of what happened on that field spread through the base faster than any official statement could contain it. By the time the afternoon sun had shifted lower in the sky, soldiers who had nothing to do with the K9 demonstration were quietly making their way toward the administrative tent, drawn by whispers of 7 dogs surrounding a stranger, of a name from Vietnam surfacing after decades of silence, Stories like this remind us how many quiet acts of devotion and loss simply fade with time, unnoticed, unrecorded, until something unexpected pulls them back into the light. That is part of why stories like Eleanor's deserve to be remembered, not just witnessed once and forgotten. The base commander himself, Colonel James Whitfield, arrived within the hour, having heard a second-hand account. Strange, he insisted on seeing the situation himself. He was a serious man in his 50s, not given to sentimentality, and he had expected, frankly, some kind of exaggerated story that would shrink down to something explainable once he had the full picture. Instead, he found 7 working dogs still gathered protectively around an elderly widow, refusing to leave even when their handlers gently tried to reposition them for evening kennel routines. He found Master Sergeant Coyle, one of the most level-headed professionals on the base, visibly shaken by what she had uncovered in the archives. And he found Eleanor Marsh, composed but exhausted, sitting with a photograph of her late husband resting on her knee, like it was the most important object in the entire facility. "Mrs. Marsh," Colonel Whitfield said, lowering himself into the chair across from her with genuine gravity. "I want to apologize to you, sincerely, on behalf of everyone at this ceremony today. You were seated in the back of that field this morning like an afterthought, and, from what I'm hearing, some of my own staff treated your presence here as little more than a courtesy invitation. That was wrong. It was disrespectful to your husband's service, and to you personally, and I intend to make sure it doesn't happen again." Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she shook her head gently. "I didn't come here expecting anything, Colonel. I came because an invitation arrived, and some part of me wanted to finally bring Harold's photograph somewhere that might remember him, even just a little." "Well," Whitfield said quietly, "it seems your husband and his dog made sure they'd be remembered today, whether anyone planned for it or not." He turned to Coyle. "Walk me through exactly what we know." Coyle laid it out methodically. Staff Sergeant Harold Marsh, military police K-9 handler, 3 tours in Vietnam, killed in action in 1971 during an ambush while his dog Duke fought to defend his position even after sustaining injuries himself. Duke had survived, been treated, and like countless working dogs of that era, was not brought home with the family, a policy that had quietly devastated thousands of military families who were simply told their dogs were reassigned. With no further explanation and no path to ever finding out what became of them. Records showed Duke had eventually been placed into a domestic training and breeding program for working military dogs in the years following his retirement from active service, a program designed to preserve valuable bloodlines from dogs who had proven exceptional in combat conditions. Tank, the lead shepherd who had broken formation first that morning, was a direct descendant 4 generations removed. "There's something else," Coyle added, pulling up another file. I cross-referenced the breeding program records with veterinary behavioral notes from the era. There's a documented phenomenon, not widely discussed outside specialized circles, of certain working line dogs displaying heightened reactivity to specific verbal cues associated with their bloodline's original handler, especially phrases used repeatedly and emotionally during the dog's early training. It's rare. It's not fully understood. But it's documented. Whitfield turned back to Eleanor. "The phrase your husband used, old soldier, do you remember exactly how he said it? The tone, anything specific?" Eleanor's voice trembled. "He used to crouch down right in front of Duke, hold his face in both hands, and say it low and slow, 'Old soldier,' like he was talking to a person, not a dog." Coyle exchanged a glance with the colonel. "Mrs. Marsh, would you be willing to say it now? Just to Tank?" Eleanor hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached out toward the massive shepherd lying at her feet. She lowered herself slightly in her chair, the way Harold must have done so many decades ago, and whispered the words into the quiet tent. Old soldier. Tank's head rose instantly, his ears snapped forward, and he let out a long, low sound, somewhere between a whine and a sigh, before pressing his head firmly against her chest and refusing once again to move. No body in that tent spoke for a long moment. Somewhere behind Whitfield, a young soldier who had slipped in to watch wiped quickly at his own eyes, pretending it was nothing. What happened over the following days transformed quietly into something far bigger than anyone at that base had anticipated. The photograph taken during the original ceremony, 7 military working dogs surrounding a weeping widow on a folding chair, had been shared by an off-duty photographer's personal account before anyone in public affairs realized it had left the building. Within 48 hours, it had reached news outlets across the region. Within a week, veterans from across the country were reaching out, sharing their own stories of dogs they'd lost track of after deployments, of family members who never learned what happened to the animals who'd served beside their loved ones. Colonel Whitfield, to his credit, did not let the moment pass as a curiosity to be forgotten once the cameras left. He personally reviewed Harold Marsh's full service record and discovered, buried in decades-old paperwork, that Harold had been recommended for a Bronze Star for actions during the same engagement that claimed his life. A recommendation that had been lost somewhere in the bureaucratic confusion of a chaotic war. Never finalized, never delivered, never spoken of to the family who deserved to know. He made it his personal mission to correct that oversight. 3 weeks after the Memorial Day ceremony, the base organized a formal recognition event, not a hastily arranged photo opportunity, but a genuine ceremony attended by active duty soldiers, veterans, base leadership, and to Eleanor's quiet astonishment, several Vietnam veterans who had served in the same unit as Harold decades earlier and had traveled hundreds of miles once they heard the story. Eleanor stood at the front of the formation this time, not in a back row folding chair, but in a place of honor beside Colonel Whitfield, with Tank sitting at perfect attention beside her, his head reaching almost to her shoulder. Master Sergeant Coyle read the citation aloud, her voice steady despite the emotion plainly etched across her face, detailing the actions of Staff Sergeant Harold Marsh and his K-9 partner Duke on the night that had taken one of their lives and forever changed the other. Staff Sergeant Marsh, alongside his military working dog, held a defensive position under heavy fire, allowing 3 wounded soldiers to be evacuated safely before his own position was overrun. Coyle read. Duke sustained significant injuries defending that position even after his handler had fallen, refusing to abandon his post until reinforcements arrived. This delayed recognition, 55 years overdue, is presented today not only in honor of Staff Sergeant Marsh's sacrifice, but in honor of every working dog whose service was never properly remembered by the nation they protected. When Colonel Whitfield placed the Bronze Star into Eleanor's trembling hands, the entire formation rose into a slow, deliberate salute. Soldiers who had never known Harold Marsh honoring a sacrifice that had waited 5.5 decades to be acknowledged. Eleanor pressed the medal to her chest, her eyes finding Tank's steady gaze beside her, and for the first time in 19 years of widowhood, she felt something settle inside her that she hadn't realized was still unresolved. A young private nearby, watching the ceremony, leaned toward his sergeant and asked quietly, what everyone in the crowd seemed to be wondering, "What do you think Tank actually recognized?" Was it the scent passed down somehow through generations of breeding, the tone of her voice repeating words spoken decades ago, or something else entirely that none of us will ever fully understand? It's worth sitting with that question for a moment, because there may not be one single right answer, only the quiet certainty that something true and important passed between an old woman and 7 dogs who had never met her before that morning. Standing near the back of the crowd, an elderly man in a faded VFW cap, one of Harold's surviving squadmates, watched the entire ceremony with tears streaming freely down his face, his hand resting on the shoulder of a much younger soldier beside him. Perhaps a grandson who had brought him to witness something he never expected to see in his remaining years. It was the kind of moment that reminds people watching at home of their own fathers, their own grandfathers, the dogs that once slept at the foot of a childhood bed, the relatives whose service was quietly folded away in cedar boxes and never spoken of enough while there was still time. In the weeks following the ceremony, something unexpected happened that nobody, least of all Eleanor herself, had anticipated. Master Sergeant Coyle, after consulting with the base's veterinary behavioral team and Colonel Whitfield, made an official request that surprised the entire unit. She asked whether Eleanor might consider becoming an honorary visitor to the K9 training program. Given Tank's continued and unusual attachment to her, a bond the dog had shown no signs of releasing even weeks after their first encounter, Eleanor, who had spent 19 years walking to her mailbox alone every afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock, found herself instead driving twice a week to the base, where Tank would wait by the kennel gate, ears perked, tail wagging the moment her modest sedan pulled into the lot. She brought him treats. She sat with him during training breaks. She told him stories about Harold that she had never told another living soul, stories about a young man who used to whistle off-key while shaving, who wrote letters about a dog instead of writing about the war, who had once promised her, in the last letter she ever received from him, that someday they would get a German shepherd of their own once he came home for good. He never got the chance to keep that promise. But somehow, 55 years later, the universe had handed it to her anyway, 4 generations removed and impossibly improbable, but real all the same. Colonel Whitfield, in a final gesture that brought the entire story full circle, arranged for Eleanor to be present at every future Memorial Day ceremony held at that base, not in the back row this time, but seated front and center beside whichever working dogs were on duty that year, a permanent reminder to every new generation of soldiers passing through that loyalty, once given, does not simply disappear because paperwork said it should. We almost missed this, Whitfield admitted quietly to Coyle, after the ceremony had ended and the crowds had dispersed. She was sitting in the back of that field for an hour before anyone said a single word to her. If those dogs hadn't done what they did, we never would have known any of this. We would have shaken her hand, thanked her for coming, and let her drive home to an empty house, never knowing what she was still carrying. Coyle nodded slowly. That's the thing about loyalty like that. It doesn't wait to be noticed. It just keeps showing up, generation after generation, whether anyone's paying attention or not. Today, Eleanor Marsh no longer walks to her mailbox alone at 4 o'clock, wondering if anyone remembers her husband's name. Tank visits her at home now on weekends when his training schedule allows, curled up on her porch in the same spot where Harold's old work boots used to sit by the door, as if some quiet instinct in his blood understood exactly where he belonged. The photograph of Harold and Duke no longer sits hidden in a cedar box. It rests now in a simple frame on Eleanor's mantel, right beside the Bronze Star that arrived 55 years too late, but mattered every bit as much the day it finally came. Have you ever had a dog you never forgot? One whose loyalty seemed to reach further than logic could ever explain. Or perhaps this story reminded you of a parent or a grandparent whose service was quietly folded away and never fully honored while there was still time to say thank you. We would love to hear who this story brought to mind for you. If this story touched your heart, consider leaving a like so that more people can discover stories like Eleanor's, stories about hidden heroes and the loyalty that outlasts even 55 years of silence. Here at K9 Heroes Uncovered, we share stories of military loyalty, forgotten service, and the unbreakable bonds between handlers and the dogs who never stopped protecting them. Subscribe if these stories mean something to you, because there are so many more hidden heroes still waiting to be remembered. And if you know someone who loves dogs, who served, or who has ever waited decades for a piece of someone they lost to finally come home, share this story with them today. Tell us where you're watching from and say hello in the comments below. And let us know in your own words, what part of Eleanor and Tank's story touched you the most?